Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So, as you may be aware, Module 30 brought a bunch of changes to Warlock Hellbringer, and I've been meaning to test it out to figure out what's, say, the best rotation now, particularly for single target damage where it matters most. Now, when you check back at the actual changes they done to Warlock, they pretty much went and fixed a whole load of bugs and didn't really give a lot of extra buffs to the output that damage that Hellbringer can perform. So what this results is in a different way you can play Warlock, but it's not actually a whole lot more effective than what you had in the past when there were bugs that were beneficial to you, which allowed you to output more damage, but it also meant that a newer player would get a bit more confused and wonder why people are using certain things, because they were bug abusing. Now, most of the bugs have been cleaned up, but we ultimately find Warlock is not a whole lot more effective than it was, at least here for single target damage. In multi-target, you will see a significant improvement because the fact Curse now grants combat advantage against your targets, allowing you to run different class features, along with Curse Bite properly getting its cooldown reduced by Soul Spark Recovery, and so you can actually take advantage of Parting Blasphemy, Deadly Curse with All-Consuming Curse, and ultimately be very effective in multi-target damage. And in any fight where there are lots of enemies, Warlock will shine very well, and that is going to be within the new dungeon. Both in the second and last boss, there are a lot of adds, and so Warlock will perform on par with a lot of the best classes as a result. Not because it has good single target damage, but because it has a good mix of damage. It can have very good multi-target damage while still sustaining pretty good single target damage. And getting all that extra damage from those mobs helps a long way to, say, top those Pain Giver boards. And so you will see Warlocks performing fairly well there. But if you jump back to older content, which is purely single target, particularly in, say, some trials, you will find Warlock will still underperform versus other burst classes. It has been improved a little bit, but still, I do not find Warlock to be all that more effective than it was. And my test results confirm this. I went through a whole load of different setups to find out what's actually best. I tried, say, this setup where you're using Soul Spark Recovery, and I found it was only performing upwards of 1.1 million in counter DPS. I tried it then with this, using Tyrannical Curse as your main daily power, say at the beginning of the artifact call to improve all of your abilities. And that was performing a little bit better, like 1.14 million in counter DPS. I tried then this setup, where you're using Wrathful Souls plus Tyrannical Curse as your daily power at the beginning of the artifact call, and we get 1.16 million in counter DPS. Again, further improvement. But then we tried this setup, which is ultimately what I found to be my best setup. You're using your Flames of Phlegetos daily power with all these feats and features, and we get 1.22 million in counter DPS. Now, I did try a different setup with regards to your feats, and we find it's actually not a whole lot different. Say using Soul Desecration instead of Risky Investment, which simply doubles the damage output of your, say, Soul Puppet. Not something I would consider as very reliable, because if your Soul Puppet ends up in some situation where it can't attack the boss or targets some random mob that's not important, then you will lose damage output from this. And so since there's not a lot of difference, definitely go with Risky Investment. But in this case, we got like 1.23 million in counter DPS. And then we tried this setup, which say has Creeping Death then instead of Executioner's Gift. And again, not a whole lot of difference. And in terms of this dummy test, it was a little bit more effective because we didn't fully kill the dummy during our test frame period. Now, these tests are done at a base level for all the classes, so we can correctly compare. If you want to copy the test and try find better DPS, these are my current rules, which I'm using across all of the classes, and I'm unlikely to change them for now because it's a lot of work going through all of the classes. So we can just do this for now with these requirements and then compare it versus the other classes, rather than going back and testing all the classes again with a new setup. But ultimately, this setup comes out at 1.25 million counter DPS, which was my best result. But again, in most cases, I wouldn't recommend using Creeping Death and just go with Executioner's Gift. It might depend on some of the boss fights, but in general, it will perform better throughout the entire fight. But if you're facing a boss, which say Zarya, you get down to 60% and then she heals back to full, and then you have to get her down to 0%. In those cases, Creeping Death might be better because there's a longer time that she's at the upper threshold of her hit points, and so you don't gain as much benefit from this. Basically, if the boss has 0% hit points, then you would gain 30% damage. If they're full hit points, you gain no benefit from this. And Creeping Death is just a continual damage over time effect, which did result in, as you can see here, about 6% of our overall damage. And on average, Executioner's Gift should be a 15% damage buff, which should get diminished to about 10%, 8%, depending on your damage buffs. So ultimately, the best setup that I recommend is this right here with these powers. You've got your Hellish Rebuke for the damage over time and to generate the soul sparks over time. You will try to cast this every 10 seconds in order to maintain that dot effect. Use your Hand of Blight as your main damage at will and to generate soul sparks. You're best to try and cast this at melee range, so play as melee as most as possible. Otherwise, you could be better off just casting Eldritch Blast from a distance. You use then Vampiric Embrace, it's just decent damage and does have the nice effect of survivability, giving you a bit of a heal. The only issue with it is that it has Curse Consume, which means it's removing your curse, so you'll need to reapply that curse. And that's a big reason why we have this ability, so your at-wills can reapply that curse. So you can maintain the extra damage buff via having a curse. The alternative to this is to use Blades of Vanquished Armies, but you have to either put this on a player who's always going to be next to your target, or on yourself and play next to your target, which you generally will with Hand of Blight, because the melee variant will generate more soul sparks and reduce the target's damage. Then you have Haddar's Grasp, which you pretty much have to play with since you're not playing with Power of the Nine Hells in order to summon a soul puppet. This allows you to stack up your soul investiture, giving you a little bit more damage output through risky investment. And then Killing Flames, up to 975 magnitude, and it's pretty much your highest damaging encounter power. Hellfire Ring is still fairly decent, but since you're not using Power of the Nine Hells, it's not that needed, and even then it got changed so that you can't stack it. That's one of the, say, nerfs Warlock received. You can no longer stack Soul Investiture as quickly since that nerf to Hellfire Ring. So again, I recommend Vampiric Embrace, Haddar's Grasp, and Killing Flames. Alternatively, Blades of Vanquished Armies instead of Vampiric Embrace. For your daily powers, I recommend Flames of Plaguetos, just as your highest damage output daily power. I haven't found it that useful to use Tyrannical Curse at the beginning of the artifact call for the extra damage buff. With your mechanics, keep in mind to use your Soul Scorch. It's a high damaged attack with the damage over time, which is now increased by double Scorch. Class features, you want that dust to dust. Some might argue to use Deadly Curse, but this is only going to be about 2.5% of your damage, and dust to dust is going to be at least 2.5%, if not 3% on a lot of your builds. And you need that all-consuming curse to reapply that curse every time after you use Haddar's Grasp and every time after you use Vampiric Embrace. Otherwise, you are missing Warlock's Curse, which is 15% extra damage output. You need all of these feats. Again, Double Scorch is just better for more damage output. Warlock's Curses, again, just better for more damage output. You're not playing with a Parting Blasphemy build, that's for multi-target. You want Risky Investment for the extra damage buff. Soul Desecration will give you similar damage output, but unreliable, because your soul puppet can get stuck and end up not attacking the target you actually need to kill, and so Risky Investment is generally better. And then Creeping Death versus Executioner's Gift. Against standard bosses, Executioner's Gift will be more reliable and give you more damage output. And finally, Soul Spark Recovery versus Wrathful Souls. Wrathful Souls will give you more burst damage output and in general is a lot easier to play with. Soul Spark Recovery requires you to spam your encounter powers a lot and is overall a harder playstyle, and I just didn't find it as effective, particularly when the majority of your damage is going to come from artifact calls, and you can just make use of Tactician's Precision anyway to get all the cooldown reduction you need versus gaining it by a Soul Spark recovery. So this will just be better for you in general. Ultimately, the rotation that you will use then is going to be this right here. Now, it's pretty tight on time. As soon as you've cast your artifact, you have 10 seconds to cast everything. And you need to do that quickly in order to maximize all of your damage. Again, you need to cast an at-will after casting Haddar's Grasp and after casting Vampiric Embrace in order to reapply the curse to gain the 15% extra damage buff. Otherwise, you're just losing out on damage. But if you find yourself a bit slower in terms of casting all these abilities and can't do it within 10 seconds, perhaps you want to switch over to using Blades of Vanquished Armies, as this is even a little bit more higher magnitude than Vampiric Embrace. It just requires you to play at melee range or have somebody at melee range who's reliably going to stay there, so you'd say target the tank, in order to get all of those hits off. And ultimately, it's not as good burst damage because it's, say, a dot effect, and so it's hard to get all of those hits within, say, the artifact call. But it can be easier than needing to, say, cast the at-wills between your encounters like this. It'll take some practice. And yeah, that's a 17-step rotation for your artifact call. And outside of that artifact call, you're pretty much casting your counter powers when they come off cooldown and casting your Soul Scourge when it hits 5 stacks. You see all of those pips there. Once it hits 5, cast it, and then cast your encounter powers when they're ready to go. And ultimately, that should give you the most damage over time. But yes, keep in mind, artifact calls are very important for damage output. In most classes, you're going to get half of your damage from the artifact call. And so make sure your encounter powers are off cooldown, and then you're casting that artifact and using those powers in that set rotation in order to get the maximum amount of damage output. And ultimately, we were getting like 1.25 million encounter DPS with this rotation. Again, the alternative, if you want to use Blades of Vanquished Armies instead of Vampiric Embrace and then not have to interweave as many at-wills, would be this right here. And it's a little bit quicker as well with, say, a 9-second total cast time. And outside of the artifact call, you'll just use your encounter powers when they come off cooldown, and you'll use your Soul Scorch as soon as you hit 5 of those stacks. You can see them over here on the left side. We currently have 1 stack. You want to get that to 5 before you go and cast your Soul Scorch in order to maximize that damage output from Wrathful Souls and the general damage buff you gain per Soul Spark. And of course, you'd ideally cast your encounter powers before you cast the Soul Scorch. It's just don't wait too long. Like, you don't want to be having 5 stacks and then waiting another 3-4 seconds before actually casting this. Otherwise, you are just losing a lot of damage by missing that dot effect. Now, ultimately, where does that put Warlock versus other classes? At 1.15 million counter DPS. Well, as you can see, it's still in the same position as before, like 10th place. So it's not that great. It is still a very solid class, and will do very well in the Dread Sanctum here, because of the fact you have multiple enemies to kill and a lot of abilities that can make use of killing lots of enemies. Like Blades of Vanquished Armies is a multi-target attack. Same with Tyrannical Curse if you use that instead of your Flames of Phlegetos. This is a really high damage multi-target effect, causing all of your attacks over 20 seconds to just hit everybody within 30 feet of the target. Don't underestimate it. As soon as there are multiple enemies to be able to hit, you'll get a ton of, say, just splash damage with that, which will definitely boost you up in the Pain Giver board significantly versus other classes. So you can do well, but in a full single target scenario, you still struggle. And the recent updates didn't exactly improve you much at all. Again, it was mainly just bug fixes, some minor magnitude increases, which ultimately only really compensated you for the damage you lost due to those bug fixes. So Warlock's not much better than it was before. Now keep in mind, I need to go back and retest Bard and Whisper Knife, as they both got nerfed, and I assume they're going to be down to about the level where Cleric is, where Barbarian is, around that 1.6, 1.5 million encounter DPS. That's my assumptions based on looking at the nerfs, but I need to go back and retest them. So you won't have them say significantly higher than everything else. But still, Warlock, compared to the rest, is underperforming a bit. And yeah, don't worry too much about Paladin. It doesn't actually have a DPS path, so it's not really supposed to have good single target damage. It's pretty much just a healer or a tank, and that's it. Ultimately, that's it. These two rotations that I recommend, depending on if you want to use Blades or Vampiric Embrace. Keep in mind again of the Curse Consume effect. You need to be reapplying that with an at-will to maintain your full damage buff here. So thanks all for watching. A massive thank you to all these channel members for their extra support, and we'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.